This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's unsupervised learning.
I am here with a very special guest, Dr. J.P. Mallory. Dr. Mallory, could you introduce yourself?
I'm Jim Mallory. I am Professor Emeritus. I've been retired for 10 years. Professor Emeritus of Prehistoric Archaeology at Queen's University, Belfast. I have a Ph.D. in Indo-European studies, and one of the main areas that I've normally been interested in is the search for the Indo-European homeland. I did my Ph.D. on the topic back in 1975. But I also do other things as well, and I've excavated for probably at least 20 years in the field, particularly here in Ireland.
Yeah, I read your book on the origins of the Irish. I think was it like 2014 or 2013? It was a really good book, and maybe we could talk about that a little if we have some time. But I guess first I would like to talk about the last decade or so, what's happened with changes in methodology, and maybe even earlier, what you've seen and how things have changed.
Right. I've listened to some of your other podcasts with some other people regarding the Indo-European homeland and ancient DNA and archaeology and migrations and things. And it occurred to me, just possibly for the benefit of listeners or whatnot, I try to give this a deeper historical look and to some extent perhaps a little bit broader look as well compared to some of the other speakers, just to put things into a bit of context. I'm going to try to do this as fast as possible, and so you can tell me to shut up and move on anywhere along this. It seems like I've digressed far too much. The Indo-European homeland problem has been with us for over 2 centuries now, and it has not been entirely solved to the satisfaction, certainly, of everybody. And so you do have to wonder, 200 years on the same problem and not coming up with, a complete solution does look a little bit worrisome. So how in the world did we get here? For the 19th century, all the way up until the 1870s, the solution was fairly simple. It was where in Asia was the Indo-European homeland, because pretty well any scholar would have presumed that the starting point for Indo-European expansions had to be Asia, for a variety of reasons. One, before the development of prehistoric archaeology, everybody thought purely in terms of the historical record, and the earliest historical record is that of the Near East and Asia. And therefore, we had a concept of ex oriente lux, from the East light. And it was generally presumed that whatever was new in the world, whatever evolved in the world, wherever there was progress in the world, it was coming out of Asia from the East. And that Europe would have entirely been a backwater to Asia. And another aspect of this was the fact that with the discovery of the relationship between the ancient languages of India and Iran with those of the classical languages of Europe, this sort of initially blew people's minds away. And they suddenly had this corpus of texts that seemed to them to be extraordinarily ancient, more ancient than anything that we had in the West. And consequently, if you're going to locate the origin of this common language, you're going to try to put it as close as possible to both India and Iran. And therefore, the homeland sort of migrated a little bit between, shall we say, the Hindu Kush and maybe the Aral Sea, with Bactria, that is modern Afghanistan, being a particular favorite. And as I said, all the way up to about 1870, that was pretty well it. There were a few notable exceptions. such as Robert Latham, an English linguist, who argued for a European homeland, and another linguist, Theodor Benfi, who actually I think is the first person in what we'll call modern times to suggest that the homeland was basically north of the Black Sea, the Russian steppeland areas. But things completely changed at the end of the 1870s, and it came from a direction that hadn't been really used before then. And the initial book was by a man named Theodor Pisha, a linguist who actually spent as much of his time in America as he did in Europe. But he published a book based on an analysis of descriptions of the ancient Indo-Europeans as being blonde, blue-eyed, light pigmentation, etc. And he began this association between what we all call the phenotype of sort of blonde Aryans of sorts. Uh, Unfortunately for him, he imagined that if you're going to look for the center of this, you looked for the area that had the highest incident of albinism, loss of pigmentation. And consequently, he placed the homeland in the Pripyat marshes. And these are the marshes between Belarus and the northern part of the Ukraine. And so for him, the homeland had basically moved from Afghanistan to near Chernobyl, which curious, places to place this sort of Eden of the Indo-Europeans. But he was swiftly contradicted by a linguist, ethnologist named Karl Penka, who produced several books indicating that the Indo-Europeans, such an energetic race, as he called them, could not possibly have grown up in an unhealthy environment like a swamp. And therefore, he moved the homeland to Northern Europe. And this, I think, really caught the public imagination. When we take a look at accounts of the development of Indo-European studies in the 19th century, this became the really popular books and the popular idea. And it set off almost a whole chain of people arguing about what we'll call the racial configuration or appearance of the earliest Indo-Europeans. And Penka is one of the people who began starting shall we say, the whole myth of what we'll call the blonde, blue-eyed true Aryans as an idea. And he placed the homeland in basically Northern Europe, Southern Scandinavia. And he also made the leap from what we'll call simply appearances to skeletal evidence, and argued that the association should be with people who were dolichocephalic, that is, had long heads. And there grew up an entire battleground between those who believed that the earliest Indo-Europeans had long heads and had blonde hair, blue eyes, and the rest of that, and those who believed that actually they were shorter, they had brown hair, brown eye, darker eyes, and were brachycephalic, that is, broad-headed. And this continued, and it would stay like this, I'm afraid, all the way up until, well, it was, shall we say, settled to some extent at Nuremberg after World War II. But by 1900, prehistoric archaeology had entered the fray, particularly in the hands of a man named Gustav Cassina, who began taking a look at European prehistory in terms of cultural groups which he believed echoed or represented ethnic groups and linguistic groups. And the hunt for a homeland based on archaeology began. And in this hunt, what people were looking for was initially a culture X, a culture that was so big that it could pretty well explain all of the distribution of the Indo-European languages across Europe and Asia. None was found. So they were going for the next best thing, the largest cultures that they could find, cultural entities that looked like they had expanded and had expanded at the right time. And three cultures eventually emerged in the first decades of the 20th century. One was the linear Bonkeramic, a Neolithic culture that would date about 5,500 to 4,500 BC, that spread right across Danubian Europe, from, shall we say, the westernmost part of the Ukraine on the far east, all the way to Atlantic France and the west. The second major contender was the Corded Ware culture. This comes later. It would have come, let's say, just around 3,000 to 2,500 BC, and it expanded even further from, let's say, the Netherlands right across Northern Europe as far east as the Ural Mountains. And the third culture to emerge as one of the potential homelands was the steppeland culture, which we frequently identify now as the Yamnaya culture, which would have occupied the area north of the Black Sea, basically from the mouth of the Danube, as far east, at least as the Urals. Actually, Yamnasites gone just a little further east than that. And so you had three big entities that were vying with one another. And you could play with them as an archaeologist, but the thing is that you needed linguistic evidence as well to run with any of these. And by around 1900, a theory that the homeland was in the Russian steppe had been proposed by Otto Schroeder, who was a sort of a powerhouse of Indo-European studies. And he argued it for a variety of reasons that were based on what we'll call linguistic geography and linguistic paleontology. That is, it looked like the right environment compared to what we knew of the ancient Indo-Europeans. It helped solve one really major problem that had dogged Indo-European studies from the 19th century onwards, was that the Asian Indo-Europeans, that was known then, would have been the Indo-Iranians. They shared the same vocabulary for domestic livestock as the European languages, but they had almost nothing of the vocabulary for agricultural, cereal agriculture that you found in the West. And therefore, if you put the homeland north of the Black Sea, you could have it straddle the steppe lands, the open steppe grasslands, which are conducive to pastoralism. But also, once you had crossed the west of the Dnieper River, you go right into what was the breadbasket of the former Soviet Union, the fertile lands of the Ukraine, which produced, and it was even known by around 1900, major agricultural archaeological sites of the Tripolia culture. So it helped solve, it made the Indo-European homeland big enough that it could deal with the emergence of two different economies coming out of a single language group. Now, this theory at first did not get much traction. I noticed that in 1912, another major monograph regarding the ancient Indo-Europeans and their homeland, etc., by Sigmund Feist, was rather favorable to Otto Schroeder's theory, but described it as rather isolated. And it was being attacked by those who supported a North European homeland with the Corded Ware culture. But by the 1920s, it was becoming increasingly popular. V. Gordon Childe, one of the probably the most influential, I suspect, archaeologists in Europe of the first half of the 20th century, gave it sort of tentative support, not full support because there was problems with chronology. And by support, what it meant is that you had, growing up between these different camps, uh, an idea that you're going to have a battle, shall we say, between two homelands, the Corded Ware culture and the steppe cultures. And what was growing was an absolute acceptance that the Corded Ware culture was certainly Indo-European. And there was also a growing acceptance that the steppe cultures were Indo-European. So how in the world did you come up with a theory that could deal with both of these different cultures? One of the things that was not working very well was the idea that the steppe cultures had developed somehow from the Corded Ware area or the Corded Ware culture. On the other hand, those who supported the steppe culture being the origin going to have a tough time trying to prove that the Corded Ware culture came from the steppe lands. But there were archaeologists trying to do this. Child was one. It was accepted by some others in the 1920s. By the 1930s, there had evolved a theory that the Indo-European homeland was indeed in the steppe lands of north of the Black Sea, north of the Caspian Sea, and that there was archaeological evidence for an expansion of the population from that area, known as generally the people of the civilization of the Kurgans. These are the burial mounds. Today, normally what they were talking about was the Yamnaya culture. And that culture expanded both to the east into Asia to explain the Asian Indo-Europeans, and it moved also into the West and underlay the foundation of the Corded Ware culture. And basically, these two theories were locked against one another throughout the 1930s and 40s, and pretty well stayed that way. After the war, and once you removed, we'll call the blonde master race Aryans and the rest of that, which really contributed absolutely nothing to the settlement of anything, other theories that developed still would contrast maybe a homeland set with the Neolithic of Central Europe against the steppe land areas. And so these things would be argued back and forth. Many different, I'm only giving you, the broadest, two major contenders. There are a lot of other contenders, and there always have been, and there still are other contenders, but we're going for the big ones right now. I think the passion regarding Indo-European homeland probably had died down at least considerably, but by the 1950s, there was a new entrance into the battle, and that was Marija Gimbutas. And Gimbutas had the advantage.
And I do want to say this is someone you know very well.
Very
she was
well.
your mentor.
She was not only was she my Ph.D. supervisor, and I worked on excavations with her, she was also my landlady. And I spent a number of years living
I'm not
in
sure. I'm not sure if that would be allowed today.
Probably not. Living in a bungalow on her estate, shall we call it, up in Topanga Canyon in California, in which I paid partially in. I had a roommate as well. We both paid partially in coin and partially in labor. Every Saturday, we were either cutting wood, pulling weeds, cleaning swimming pools, things like that. Yeah, strange world back then, but for a graduate student, it was great, actually. In any event, she had, a great mastery of the archaeological literature all across Europe, from one end to the other. She had a very broad perspective on things, and she could take the idea of the steppe land and bring it really up to speed. And because she was publishing regularly in the English language, the whole idea of a steppeland homeland became very closely associated with her. And she was paying attention to the latest developments among, then Soviet archaeologists. And so her perspectives were always up to date, and at least to some extent in tune with what was going on in Russia, the Ukraine, and throughout Eastern Europe. And so she argued for the major expansion of the cultures from the steppe, both east and west. Now, Corded Ware. One of the perspectives that I think we need to pay attention to is that when we're looking at these three big cultures, linear bond ceramic, Corded Ware, and Yamnaya, these three contenders, when we're dealing with the linear bond ceramic, we've got sort of a full picture as we can of a culture as archaeologists. We've got their settlements, we have exactly their house plans, which are quite spectacular. We know what their economy was like. We know the full range of their non-perishable technology. We've got the evidence of their burials. However, the Corded Ware culture and the steppe cultures are basically mortuary cultures. That is about all we know. Over 90% of the evidence that we have simply comes from burials. We do not have the settlements. What evidence we have for the economy comes from whatever they may have placed inside the burials. And whether that's reflecting the actual economy or not, that's difficult to say because that could simply be ritual. And so when archaeologists had to deal with the origin of the Corded Ware culture, they were basically trying to deal with certainly at least one hand tied behind their back. We did not have the full range of cultural attributes of either culture to compare with the other. And so when archaeologists took a look at the Corded Ware and compared it with what was going on the steppe, and arguing that the Corded Ware came from the steppe, it was a hard sell. And the reason why it was a hard sell is that the comparisons that were being made were pretty generic. They weren't the types of specific things that archaeologists are particularly happy, of dealing with. And just to give you an idea of what happened, and I'm trying to give you the mental framework of archaeologists leading up to 2015, which is the watershed day where the world begins to change. Archaeologists, such as myself, who supported a steppe homeland, when it came to the Corded Ware culture, by and large, we could mention that you could make a case that it had links with the steppe based on a number of sort of generic similarities, but the specific details of it were very difficult to come up with. Even Gimbutas, when you take a look at her writings, is really quite vague. And for her, the Corded Ware culture comes under the classification of hybrid cultures, where there was sort of a slow infiltration of steppe peoples into Central and Northern Europe that eventually produced the Corded Ware culture and altered it from its earlier Neolithic roots. And so things were pretty vague, so vague that by certainly around 2010 to 2015, you weren't even normally imagining much in the way of a population intrusion, but the idea that what was being sold was what we'll call a Yamnaya package. That is a series of traits or characteristics that were adopted by people in Central and Northern Europe, but not necessarily involved much in the way of, shall we say, genetic affiliation of the actual populations. And therefore, it would have been things like, well, they adopted certain types of Yamnaya metallurgy, for example, or wheeled vehicles or domestic horse or things like that. And you don't have to marry somebody to get a wheeled vehicle, a domestic horse, or battle, or anything else like that. And just to give you an idea how rough this was, if you take a look at some of the opponents of the idea that there was a migration, such as Lothar Killian, he listed 24 characteristics that typify the steppe culture and the Corded Ware culture. And of those 24, he found only 4 of those traits were shared by both of them. And they were pretty generic. For example, they both had tumuli, mounds, kurgans, call them what you want. And you don't get too many points for that because that's a pretty generic thing. And we can find in Central Europe cultures before the Corded Ware culture that were raising mounds over their dead. You don't have to go all the way to the Ukraine or Russia to find them. You could find them much closer to the Corded Ware culture. Another thing was the use of cord decoration. That's not, a giant leap for mankind, I think. Another one was the burial of the dead on the back with the legs flexed. That's not too terribly rare. And finally, they had ornaments of perforated teeth. And you're going to be damn lucky to find a culture that didn't have ornaments using perforated animal teeth or something like that. So you see, the comparisons that were being put up there were really, really pretty generic. And just to give you an idea of how contrary to the demands that one might have expected, the steppe cultures, the Yamnaya culture, is also known as the ochre grave culture because of the pretty well regular dusting of the burials with red ochre. This is found throughout the Yamnaya culture. It's not found in the Corded Ware culture. There is a burial posture which is really typical of the early Yamnaya culture, where the person's flexed on their back and their legs were flexed up, and then when they collapsed, they fold out. So they look almost like they were riding a horse or something like that in the grave. Classic. It's called the Yamnaya position, not found in the Corded Ware culture. But when you go to the Corded Ware culture, you say, well, what is really typical of a Corded Ware burial? One of the things that you find throughout many of the cemeteries is sexual dimorphism of the burial ritual. Men are buried on their right side. Females are buried on their left side. This type of practice is not found in the Yamnaya culture. And so you can see that the types of things that an archaeologist would have been used, and if had found, they could have really run with the idea that the Yamnaya culture, helped the formation of the Corded Ware culture. They weren't there. So it's the year I think it's late 2014. And although I'm retired and keeping my head down as far as possible regarding extra things, I get requests from Nature to review 2 papers, one from the Reich Lab and one from Copenhagen. And I take a look at them. And the first one I saw, the earlier one, was from the Reich Lab, indicating that something on the order of nearly 80% of the tested Corded Ware males derive or show clear signature, a clear genetic signature of a steppe origin. And yeah, totally taken by surprise, because there was really nobody in the archaeological world with good reason maintaining that there was a major intrusion from the steppe lands into Central Europe. Even those of us who had tied our star to that idea that there was some connection, we were taken completely by surprise in that case. And then when I saw the one from Copenhagen, I actually broke out in laughter, because they had not only sampled in Western Europe, but they had also sampled in East, in the area of the Minnesota Basin and the Altai. That was an area that I knew reasonably well because I've also worked on the origin of the Tarim mummies. And what was for me totally bizarre was that the genetic evidence that they were producing was actually supporting what many people had long ago dismissed as old fashioned and worthless studies of human skulls by Russian archaeologists. And they were confirming that they had pretty well got it right. And indeed, when you think about this, Gimbutas, when she was arguing for Yamnaya expansions, uh, she was paying definite attention to the people who were looking at measurements of skulls. And you have to remember that, the early looking at skulls, broadheads versus long-headed, this was a waste of time. It was totally ridiculous. But by the 1960s and 70s, physical anthropologists, those who were still interested, had begun developing multivariate techniques. And they were not looking at single measurements, but they were looking at multiple measurements, plotting them out with principal component diagrams and things like that. And we had considerable amount of studies uh, comparing Yamnaya with Corded Ware burials. And the conclusions that were being drawn is that there was really no evidence for a Yamnaya intrusion. And I've gone back and take a look at some of those old diagrams, and in a way, you could read them when you're looking at the distribution of them. That actually they could have been read the other way, because as you know, when you've got such diagrams, how you draw your
Yeah.
circles and group these things depends. And that one of the things that comes out is that a number of the studies, when you compare it with the evidence of ancient DNA, got it right, vaguely at least, in
Yeah.
general. And that, you see, one of the questions is, are all of those physical anthropologists who are interested in studying migration and population mixes and whatnot, are they out of business now because of the evidence of ancient DNA, or are there correlations that actually indicate that the study of human skulls, which is probably a lot cheaper and cheerful than preparing of the ancient DNA samples and acquiring them, might still have something to say. Uh, and I think there might be a case for that. There is certainly a case for people working in genetics to take a look at at the samples that have been done, at least the data that have been done, particularly uh, compared to the ancient DNA. And I sometimes wonder now that one of the problems might have been that the skull measurers very often may have been grouping males and females together. Uh, and because of that, it may very well have produced so much noise regarding what
Yeah.
was actually happening that this is why they fail to see what we'll call the so-called steppe element in these Central European burials.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I will say about that is, data is data, right? This is clear and precise information, but how much information does it have? I think one thing that seems clear to me is there is pretty low power on an individual level, just because of the nature of morphological variation, from what I've seen. So, you just look at the press or the literature, and they make all sorts of conclusions, and then the DNA comes back, and it's a mismatch. Well, I mean, what's going on here? Well, I mean, on an individual level, your prediction ability is not going to be perfect, and sometimes it's quite imperfect. On the other hand, as you imply, getting ancient DNA samples is not a trivial task. There are some limitations. There are certain regions, due to their mortuary practices, where they've had a hard time getting ancient DNA. So, for example, I know from ancient Egypt, it turns out some of these embalming practices destroy DNA, they denature it, right? So, It's just been relatively difficult compared to what people were expecting. On the other hand, these morphological characteristics, just the skull, before they fossilize, as subfossils or whatnot, they tend to maintain their shape. And so you could get like huge data sets in terms of sample size from particular regions. And if there's a signal, which I'm sure there is, I think that could be useful. I think the key issue is people just need to be aware of the power issues with the genome. Potentially you have the whole genome, that's 3 billion positions to evaluate, but in practice usually you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of polymorphisms. But I mean, that's a lot of data points to sample, and so I think that's what people always need to consider. And this is outside the purview of this conversation, but this comes up routinely in my discussions with people. They don't understand how when you have a single genome, you can make this inference of a whole population. But you have to understand the single genome is just the terminal tip in a phylogeny that you're exploring. Now, 20 years ago, with say 20 markers, which is what people were using, you can't explore a whole phylogeny with 20 markers. That's just 20 markers that gives you important information, but you can't reconstruct the whole pedigree of an individual. But with a whole genome, you quite clearly can. And so I think that's what people need to consider. In ancient DNA, the first samples that scholars have gotten from a particular region, if it's a high quality sample, there really hasn't been too much information about population structure that's been gained by additional samples because of this issue where you have a population, it's well mixed. That means any given individual will be a reasonable representation of that population and explore that whole genealogy. So, I mean, that's what I would consider on that issue. Now, I do want to move. So, that was obviously fascinating. And one thing I have to say is like exploring this topic. Archaeology is complicated, like any sort of scholarship. The literature is copious, and I have to say, archaeological papers can be quite long. I've opened up multiple papers where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going to read this, and it's 57 pages or something. I don't know like what's going on here. Like if it's an issue that's dedicated to one publication, and then there's like 27 pages with site layouts, and so there's a lot to go through. I wonder. So you studied under Marija, and she came to a lot of conclusions. And I talked about this with David Anthony. My understanding was she was quite a bit of a dissident within the profession, and I'm just curious, what that was like, because obviously she's your PhD mentor, you're associated with her, you're in her academic genealogy. What was that like over the decades?
It was well. First, just regarding archaeological papers, etc. One of the things I was lucky about regarding Marija is that she was a lumper rather than a splitter, and that makes a big difference. Your ability, you can take a look at European prehistory, and you can take a look at every regional variant of a culture and drive yourself totally mad. Whereas she would sort of lump things together. She was a big picture person rather than the minutiae. And I suspect when you're talking about the 60-page archaeological papers and stuff like that, you're very often talking about sort of that sort of thing as well, where you don't really actually even see where the thing is going. When I did my PhD, and that would be not just me, but there was a number of others as well, over a period of maybe around 20 years or so. We were living in a schizophrenic environment because Marija was teaching what we would call classic cultural history. And therefore, her approach, which basically involved moving cultures around on a board through time with migrations and things like that, that was going well out of fashion in certainly the English-speaking archaeological world. That was just, if you wanted to compare it with, let's say, a British university at the same time or so. And so it was generally falling considerably out of favor. But she was teaching in the Indo-European studies program. And this was separate from the anthropology department. And archaeologists in America are trained in anthropology programs. And the anthropology department, we were teaching or being taught the new archaeology when the new archaeology was new. Uh, and therefore, you could take your classes. Well, you could take classes from Lou Binford, the founder of the new archaeology. I was being taught in theory and method by his uh, sort of his students, Jim Hill and Jim Sackett. Uh, and you were being taught basically that what Marija was doing was just completely passe, simply not the way at all to approach archaeology. We were being taught, new techniques where you basically should be attempting to set up hypotheses that one could test against the archaeological record. I did a course in archaeological theory and method. It had only one textbook, and the textbook was Karl Hempel's, the German philosopher's book on basically the logic of scientific study and how to do it. And so we all had these two lines of to archaeology, which in the end I think actually paid off very well, because what it meant is that not just myself but Marija's a number of her other students all set out to take her hypotheses but then try to test them using statistical techniques and things like that we had picked up in the anthropology department. And I know at least several of the studies involve trying to test her theories. Well, one regarding the Corded Ware culture and examination of cultural change and social change within the Corded Ware culture, and to what extent it might be explained by immigrants or local evolution and things like that. So it was a pretty fertile environment when you have two totally contrasting approaches. And the thing about it was that Marija could live with that. She could live with the fact that her students, were taking critical look at her own work.
Well, so I have a question about the Corded Ware culture and the Yamnaya culture, and I talked to David Anthony about some of Marija's ideas about migrations, and it seems like on the details, she might have been wrong about some things, but there's some general processes there that she was right about, right? But you know so I'm looking through the literature. There's the Corded Ware, there's the Yamnaya, there's other cultures in Southern Europe and whatnot, and they're named after these material artifacts. And you know so you're alluding to the fact here that we don't have much material artifacts from the Corded Ware compared to, say, their Neolithic uh, predecessor societies. The successors to the linear beaker. I think the funnel beaker at that stage, right, in Northern Europe. But
Yeah.
these are great. These are great names. Funnel beaker people. I don't know.
Oh, definitely. Victor
You
Becker
know,
culture. Yes. Yep.
but okay, so we have material artifacts. That's how you're going to name them, right? That's what you have. Today we have the genetic data, and I talked to Nick Patterson out of the Reich Lab, and I guess David Anthony is now at the Reich Lab too, and they're telling me about this new genealogical method, which I've seen in the literature, to estimate or infer relatedness using these ancient DNA data sets. And there's some reasons where, because of their data quality, traditionally they haven't been able to estimate genealogical relatedness. But Nick told me they are finding relatives, descendants of the Yamnaya in Corded Ware burials. I think this was specifically in response to a critique by an archaeologist in 2017, that whatever the genome-wide estimates, you're not determining, or you're not proving that there's descent there. And then David said that they'd used the same method, and I'd heard this through other back channels, to be frank, that they had detected basically cousins in from the western Yamnaya burial grounds that were also, there were some of their cousins were in the Afnasivo in the Altai. right? So I mean, these are determining like pretty close genetic associations, and this is in line with what you see genome wide. There's not that much subtle structure here. Like this seems like one group of people that are randomly mating. They're mating with each other. So if we had had the DNA, I'm just wondering like how the naming would go, because as you said, there's differences, and then there's also like not as much material culture from the Corded Ware as their predecessors. So, one of the things that I'm suggesting or I've argued is, you kind of think about some of these transitions, like, from things that we know, like after the fall of Rome or the fall of the Han Dynasty. I mean, in this modern world, I think people just think, well, time proceeds and it's kind of like a Whiggish ascending track upward in terms of social complexity or material culture. But that just wasn't true for the pre-modern world. Maybe on a rough trend line if you kind of look far back enough. But even on the scale of 500 years, there's ups and downs in terms of social complexity. And so these Corded Ware, they don't have these complex, nice settlements that leave a big impact in the archaeological record, because I mean they're coming into a fallen world, and I think we think of them. My conjecture is you think of them kind of like the Bronze Age or post Bronze Age, early Iron Age warlords in Dark Age Greece after the fall of the Mycenaeans, where there are these big citadels, but they're not using them. And I point out like Odysseus, if you read about what he was doing in Ithaca, I mean, the guy was still tending flocks supposedly. His sister marries a wealthy swineherd. I mean, these are not like grand people at this point. But there's weird motifs in this Homeric literature that still harken back to the Bronze Age. In any case, I think we need to use these models to try to understand what's going on here, because the people obviously don't have writing, and we don't have crystal clear oral culture from that period. Though I think maybe I want to get that with the Irish if we can get to that. Talk about what traditions might be passed down from there. But I mean, you as an archaeologist, you with this training, I mean, I asked Chris Johnson, and because I don't know, this is not my area. I mean, would we even call the Corded Ware and the Yamnaya different people with what we know how they're related? On the other hand, you as an archaeologist are also telling me, well, I mean, there are actually considerable differences between the two. So, I mean, how do we make this, call here? Like, we know they're genetically very similar in the early period, like a total transplantation, right? We know they're related, and yet on the other hand, there are these, differences between them, as well as some similarities. Like, I mean, how do we demarcate these cultures? How would they think of themselves?
Oh, well, yeah, you have a series of impossible questions. I mean, archaeologists have always had almost an impossible difficulty dealing with these cultures, because these cultures are modern constructs by archaeologists. Obviously, they're not uh, necessary representations of any form of ethnic group or worldview of the populations who occupied, who may have seen things entirely different as to who they were related to or who they were not related to. Uh, I, I imagine that things are probably still safest if archaeologists still maintain their own nomenclature for these things, because at least we know what we're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
in a sense that we also know what we are not talking about uh, as ethnic groups, etc. And the fact that the people might even be related, geneticists may indicate relationships that we would presume, well, they're so closely related, they clearly must have recognized that relationship, when human beings, I think, have always shown a perfect capacity uh, to to find reasons to differentiate other populations, depending on the situation, etc., irrespective
Mm-hmm.
of how closely related they are. Uh, uh, so I don't know how, if you keep the two disciplines apart, then they can be compared with one another, and then
Mm-hmm.
we can try to deal with the clear problems that do exist, like this. this entire question of how in the world can the corded ware look so steppe-like and yet share so little of what we'll call the steppe material culture or behavior, other than perhaps pastoralism, and which might very well be the element of a key element in this, but what it's done, I think, is that if the geneticists are correct, we are dealing with cases of what we'll call punctuated cultural evolution that we never saw coming.
Yeah. So, like something that's discontinuous and just kind of changes in a generation or two is what it looks like.
Exactly. And that is something that, archaeologists normally have operated on, longer time scales. And if such a thing can happen, uh, uh, I mean, we're going to really have to worry this one for quite some time, I suspect, before we resolved it. Uh, that's the hard thing. The nice thing is, it really is an absolutely lovely problem to worry about. See, what I'm imagining is that try to imagine that. Forget Yamnaya. Try to imagine these are horses, and we've got horses coming all the way down the Danube. But once we cross the Tisa River and we go into Central Europe, we find zebras. And you guys in the genetics labs have just told us that those zebras are really horses.
Yeah.
And we're just like, what? How in the world did that happen? And that sort of represents the impact, of genetics on the way archaeologists tended to look at things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and just to step back, I mean, a lot of listeners know this, but this is a lot to take in over a 5 to 10 year period. It's just, it's been a revolution. Like, that's an overused word, but it's been a revolution. It's been a flood of data. I know the geneticists themselves have no interpretive framework really to understand this in a more than ad hoc way. And so they're trying to bring archaeologists into the mix. But, archaeologists aren't geneticists, so they're just being thrown a lot of data, throwing a lot of plots, and it can be a little confusing. And there's no straight line inferences that what you can make. So, for example, the best genetic data now that we have from Roman Italy, Iron Age, Bronze Age Roman Italy, is indicating that there were really no genetic differences between the Latins and the Etruscans, right? And we know enough about the Etruscans to know that they were not Indo-European. They were very culturally distinct. And so, what's going on here? I mean, I can present a hypothesis. You assume two populations, they're adjacent to each other. There's X amount of gene flow. Over time, they're going to homogenize, but they can maintain their cultural distinctions, right? And so we can imagine a situation like that. And then you have the situation with the Yamnaya, all these phenomenon that are occurring, and then we get all this influx of data, and then people like me come in and they just ask you like, well, I mean, so what do you think? Like, what's the conclusion? And
The thing is, one of the reasons why I mentioned the development of physical anthropology is that basically, when these things, in a way, it is sort of mirroring the impact of ancient DNA. Once people began throwing up, this evidence, of physical anthropology, it was as if the discipline suddenly got a case of the head staggers and didn't know what to do with it. But it was just an absolute total flurry of research and very unwell-founded argument. But nevertheless, I mean, it really just completely stirred the pot. And linguists were trying to deal with this type of evidence as well. And you get one of these cases of disciplined battles as to who has control over the narrative. And what I suspect is that archaeologists are worrying to some extent that the geneticists are beginning to control the narrative completely.
Well, so you know what the issue is. You have here two predominantly patriarchal cultures that have not
I was
interacted
trained
until recently.
basically by female archaeologists, by the
Yeah.
way, but yes, but go
Okay.
ahead. Yes,
Well, but I mean, so they're powerful, powerful, women in this culture,
yes,
and
yes,
they're trying to determine their dominance, and you
yes.
know, I'm just saying, like, I think to an alien, it would seem really strange because it's like like these Russian dolls where
Yes,
everything is exactly the same in some deep ways, and they're talking about their past, but their past is actually the present, and
yep,
I want, but before we end, I do want to really talk about some of the specific details. I read your book In Search of the Indo-Europeans. I mean, probably in the 1990s, a long time ago. I think you wrote that in the 1980s, maybe the late 80s. I also read The Origins of the Irish. As I said, like
yep.
about 10 years ago. That was right before a lot of ancient DNA. So there's a lot that's coming, and then a lot that's happened. And so I want to ask you about some specific details. So you mentioned the Tocharians, and I know I think you had a book with Victor Mayer on that, the Tarim Mummies. I think I read that one.
Yeah.
It's hard. There's some of these Tarim books are honestly, I just remember the pictures, you know. But so I think Nicheng et al. There's a preprint. There's been some work on this. So the Afnasivo culture of like 3300 BC or so, down into the 2000s, early 2000s. They're basically Yamnaya. Just genetically, the similarity between them is even greater than Corded Ware. There's very little initial non-Yamnaya uptake, and also unlike the Corded Ware, the Y chromosome lineage is a basal R1b, which is very similar. So that this probably means that there are probably paternal clans that span Yamnaya and the Afnasivo. And I was talking to you about names earlier, but I'm pretty sure that in the period before 3000 BC, I mean, they probably would have had the same name for each other because same paternal lineage, almost genetically exactly the same. Material culture seems to be very similar from what I understand. And so the question here is, what is their relationship to Tocharians? Now, I think the important point that needs to be said here is that it looks like the Yamnaya were not the last Indo-Europeans to arrive in the general region of the Altai and Xinjiang, and there were Indo-Iranian, I mean Iranian speakers that arrived later. We know this from the historical records, the Saka and other groups that eventually wandered back into Central Asia. And now we have a lot of genetic transects of the Scythians and other people in this region, and they're Iranian. They have European farmer ancestor. These are descendants of funnel beakers, and it looks like the best possible explanation now is that a group of eastern corded ware did actually go through the Pripyat Marsh zone and along the forest steppe boundary. Back towards the Urals, became the Sintashta, the Andronova horizon, and then expanded all over the place. And it includes this area that the Afnasivo were. And the Afnasivo are genetically distinct because they have none of the European farmer ancestry, and they have somewhat different lineages. So I've been talking for a while. Here's my hypothesis. I think the genetic signal doesn't seem super clear right now, probably due to statistical power. We'll see how that goes. But it looks to me like that the Tocharians probably are descended from the Afnasivo because linguistically they're supposedly an outgroup. That would make sense if they separated off first, but they probably, that cultural impact is on the north and the east side of the Tarim Basin, where the Iranian languages and groups are on the south and the west side. And so if you have a situation in the modern era where they're all quote unquote bracketed under Uyghurs and there's gene flow, it's pretty hard to like disentangle the signal. So I think that's why the genetic signal is not as clear. There has been no clear cut answer about that, but people do routinely ask, like, what is your take on the origins of the Tocharians now with what we know about genetics?
Uh, we still don't know. We have several problems here. Because I first approached this as an archaeologist, and uh, here's the problem. The Afanasyevo culture, the genetics and everything else, its relationship with Yamnaya, that is fine. That has been recognized widely even before ancient DNA. People were willing to accept, not everybody, but people were willing to accept on the basis of physical anthropology that they were all agreed. Skulls of Afanasyevo were indistinguishable pretty well from that of a Yamnaya. Uh, so that's another one of those cases where the the skull measurers and the geneticists absolutely agreed totally. However, the Afnasyevo culture is pretty well limited to the Minnesota Basin and the Altai. And the only hint of it getting further south is in the Jungar Basin, the northernmost part of Xinjiang, in which there is some evidence for what we'll call relationships with the Afanasyevo. And this can be found in a cemetery at Shamershak, for example, which I actually visited once. But there is, so far as I can see, no convincing archaeological evidence. This is a purely archaeological for this Afanasyevo or even an Afanasyevo related culture making it south of the Tian Shan Mountains, which is the northern border to the north, which the Tocharians are to the south of. And consequently, from an archaeological point of view, although you can find the ancient DNA that you want, for example, in the Shaohe cemetery, you can't find the archaeology that you're looking for at all. There's just absolutely no comparison again. And on top of which, the cemetery that produces all these fabulous mummies that have had their DNA done is located in an area which is not historically, unless you believe in Tocharian Sea, a Tocharian area. It could have been, but it's not the area for which we have the evidence of the Tocharian manuscripts. And here we are lacking samples of the right age from the vicinity of the northern part of the Silk Road, particularly around Kurgan. If we had samples from there and they were producing the type of genetic signature we're looking for, then I think we could begin to draw dots between the points. But right now, from an archaeological point of view, the genetics are running ahead of the archaeology to some extent by indicating, a gene flow of your R1b, southwards into Xinjiang. But the archaeological evidence isn't following it at all. On the other hand, as you mentioned regarding the Andranovo culture, that you do have good evidence. You've got it, they're both north and south of the Tian Shan. So you can get Iranians into Xinjiang, but the Tocharians are still a fairly big problem, I think. I mean, I could jump to conclusions and say, all right, Afanasyevo, because that was, the theory that I was pushing. But I could be accused of getting everything wrong. I can be accused of getting stupidity. I don't mind, all of those things. But the one thing I hate being accused of is confirmation bias.
Yeah. Well, and just for the listener, I want to be clear here. There's a huge time gap here between the Afanasyevo and the Tochar. Like, we're talking the texts that you're talking about were discovered in the first millennium AD. Yes. So they're closer to us in time than they are to the original Afanasyevo. So it's a bit much, and I do think that without any clear genetic transect, I think it does seem quite clouded. In contrast to what you're saying, with the Indo-Iranian influence. Like I will say, just to the listener, I was looking at Y chromosomes in China, and north of the Yangtze, somewhere on the order of 1% of the Y chromosomes are R1a Z93, which is exactly the branch that you find in the Indo-Iranians. So there's evidence of Indo-Iranian influence pretty deep into East Asia. I think it's probably mediated through Mongols, but in any case, like this neither here nor there. You have like pretty strong evidence that their influence, if not cultural, at least genetic, extended there. So I mean that's the sort of thing that I think we want to see about the Tocharians. So I guess Tocharians still bracket under mystery, right? That's still going.
Yeah, I would leave it there. Yep.
So what about the Hittites? I'm sure. Like, have you been tracking the so far quite minimal, but there are some genetic results that came out, and that's still a little mysterious too, as well, right?
More than a little mysterious. Many people have talked about this ancient DNA revolution as it's brought about endgame to the Indo-European homeland problem. And while I think it's a game changer, it certainly hasn't brought about endgame. And and the problem is this: it's the double component of your step profile. The Eastern hunter gatherer, that's no problem. Being localized north of the Black and Caspian Sea, that's absolutely fine. But the fact that you have a Caucasian hunter gatherer gene in, and you do not know the precise source of it or when it entered, uh, has ensured that the Indo-European homeland problem is still running, uh, and that those who prefer an Asian origin can still run with it, because there are those who will say, yes, most of the Europeans are products of an expansion of steppe land pastoralists associated with Yamnaya or perhaps earlier steppe cultures. But the original Indo-European homeland is situated south of the Caucasus, uh, in one of the areas of the CHG, Caucasian hunter-gatherer, uh, and and the expansion of the Indo-Europeans should be placed from there. Consequent, because you can't find your step signature in the small sample from Anatolia. Uh, all you find is CHG mixed with Anatolian farmer. Therefore, the
Yeah.
original homeland would be located south of the Caucasus. And people have also tried to extend that to deal with the Indo-Iranians as well. That the Anatolians go to the west, from south of the Caucasus, and the Indo-Iranians go to the east. Uh, and basically, those that will wind up in Europe go north of the Caucasus, to into the steppe lands. Uh, and so you can see that as long as you've got a hypothesis like that, on the books, uh, the search for the homeland is going to continue until that is absolutely sorted out as to what the date of the entry of the CHG is, and the whole linguistic problem that genetics has thrown up, because uh, when you've got two components of your solution, EHG and CHG together, you're going to have to determine which is the gin and which is the tonic. Uh, and it is a case that there's an overwhelming temptation that I can't believe people can avoid, of asking which one of it was it the EHG that was the Indo-European part, or was it the CHG that was the Indo-European part?
Yeah.
Or do you need both of them together? There are some theories that began emerging in the at least the 30s and ran later, arguing that the Indo-European language is an amalgamation of two totally different types of languages that have come together. Uh, and that's been suggested, but most people don't go that way because uh, it'd be almost impossible to sort out the two elements that people have suggested. But when you give two totally separate genetic signatures whose populations should have been apart from one another for thousands of years, the logical conclusion is that whoever was speaking, or whatever they were speaking in EHG, it wasn't what they were speaking in CHG.
Hmm. Hmm.
And therefore, where does the mix happen? And when does it happen? If it happens, and I think I took this from your discussion with David Anthony, that believes that it most likely had to happen very early at around 6,000 BC or something like that. That is, I think, sufficiently early that it would put the entire homeland somehow north of the Black Sea.
Yeah.
If it comes much later, as others will say, it comes with the Mycop culture, or it comes with connections with early Iran or something like that, then you're playing a different game altogether. And you can run with the idea that the initial formative area of all of the Indo-European languages, including Anatolian, was south of the Caucasus.
Yeah, and just for the listener, one reason the Hittites, the Nessa are super important and super interesting is I think textually they are still by far the earliest attested Indo-European language, and it looks like the Anatolian languages, Hittite, Luwian, and I think there was one other one, that they are the kind of the outgroup in terms of the phylogeny of all the Indo-European languages. They're the ones that are the most distinct, and so some people like to create a category Indo-Hittite instead of Indo-European because the Hittites are the outgroup to all the other branches, and maybe Tocharians are the second one to go, but I think there's some debate about that. And so this is a super important question in terms of the sequencing. So since from what I remember of In Search of the Indo-Europeans, published all those decades ago, do you think your rough time scale has held up pretty well with these Pontic expansions and whatnot? I mean, my impression is that was pretty much confirmed.
Yeah, I don't think things have moved much on that because I was working with recalibrated radiocarbon dates, and those haven't shifted. And I don't think there's been any total surprises regarding the chronology of the steplands.
Yeah, yeah. Just a couple more quick questions, just as we close out. And I'm kind of curious as your opinion as someone with archaeological background. Uh, just with genetics, you create these migration patterns, and you have to create these stylized models, these facts that just to make things simple in the way you just generate your results of these pulse admixtures. And I know David Reich and his colleagues have been criticized for this. But what I'm asking is, were the Indo-European migrations? Would you say that a lot of them were substantially kind of pulses of just like rapid changes and movements, or was this a gradual expansion that moved continuously? And part of the reason I'm asking is it seems like there was a latency of many centuries before there was like a second wave of expansion, say into the British Isles with the Bell Beakers, and then into Southern Europe in like 2200, 300. This period into Greece. Now we have data, and into Italy and Spain. And is just like have archaeologists done an analysis of the spread of these cultures? Was it a continuous demic diffusion type thing, or was it just tribes that were on the move?
Hmm. Uh, I have a difficult time with some of this because the evidence of the DNA starts giving us paths, and we start following them, and it has built-in dates to them. Uh, uh, Whereas I have always thought that one of the major vectors was probably language shift and not simply language replacement
Hmm.
for the spread of the Indo-European languages. In that language shift is such a common feature
Hmm.
in the world that people adopt. It doesn't require major genetic change, and therefore, and also we don't have to put Indo-Europeans in any particular area until we've got before the evidence that they're actually there in the first place.
Hmm.
So the Indo-Europeanization, for example, of considerable parts of the Mediterranean could have been quite late, uh, given the fact that we've got survivors of non-Indo-European languages, particularly like in Iberia, where you've got
Yeah.
the Iberian language, and of course you have Basque, which probably was more predominant actually north of the Pyrenees, and then moved into and further south. And therefore, I don't need Indo-Europeans there, probably until the late Bronze Age, Iron Age. So I don't, if they weren't there until after 1000 BC or so, that's no problem. Uh, so in that sense, I can certainly tolerate longer periods of expansion. And indeed, because of Ireland, I have a difficulty with trying to date the linguistic processes with the tied with the genetic evidence, uh, because the genetic evidence now, because of the beaker culture, would indicate that you have got the steppe signal once again entering Ireland at about 2500 BC or so, uh, and normally one would immediately reach with the idea, so the Celtic languages had spread all the way to Ireland by 2500 BC. Uh, and if I follow the genetic evidence, that is certainly the easy and the least complicated explanation. But for me to do that, then I have to say and try to explain from a linguistic point of view how after nearly 3,000 years, if Irish is developing in Ireland at 2,500 BC, how is it that Irish inscriptions are so close to the earliest Gaulish inscriptions dating to about the first centuries BC? It's almost as if there's been hardly any language change for 2,500 years.
Yeah.
And that is linguistically for me totally unexpected. And by and large, people would not normally begin setting the clock for the Celtic language to disintegrate at 2,500. Now, unfortunately, once I have done something like that, I've made a stick to beat myself with, because then I have to come up with some later explanation for the spread of the Celtic language that emerges, into Irish and things like that. And so we're getting a phenomenon here where it is going to be very tempting to use genetic dates for the spreads of population as if they are absolutely symmetrical with the spread of language branches.
Yeah, which they're not, and there's some, and there's some subtleties here, in terms of the first pass on the genetics also is not, just as we're closing out here, I totally reiterate this, partly because there is unpublished work, and I don't know if you've seen this, but I think it's going to come out this year. I think it was delayed because of COVID. The initial genetic work out of the Anglo-Saxon language shift, was a little curious, using modern and even some ancient DNA, but not too much ancient DNA. That there was this massive cultural change that occurred in Eastern England in mostly the 6th century, I guess. And the archaeologists have long been saying that it just looks like there's like a new people in totality, right? I mean, just the old culture totally disappears, and then the genetics, it makes it looks like, oh well, probably at quote best, 30%, 30 to 40% of the ancestry in East Anglia is more similar to German and Dutch than it is to the rest of the British ancestry, and that drops off to very very low once you hit the Southwest, right? So I mean, then people were saying, okay, well, the genetics implies that they weren't even the majority, probably in East Anglia. Well, now they have better ancient DNA samples in the area that go across the centuries. And what they're finding is during these early centuries, there was pretty much a total replacement. But Britain is flat. At least England is flat, and the lines of communication are open. And what they're seeing is over the centuries, the amount of German-ish ancestry in the west of England increases, while in the east of England, it decreases. And so what we were seeing in the modern era is actually genetic equilibration over time that made it it's made it seem like the Anglo-Saxon migration was much less punctuated and drastic in the east than it was because of this mixing event. And so it was just a misunderstanding in a way of these original kind of incredible genetic results, and I'm just bringing this up to show that sometimes the first inference you make from the initial genetic analysis actually can mislead you, and it turns out the more simple archaeological explanation was a better fit to the better data.
Yeah, well, I think for Ireland, because I have a paper on it, I'm not quite sure whether it's come out yet or not, and I worry about it because the genetic evidence there, like I said, indicates a fairly rapid replacement, of course, of the male genome in Ireland, as well as Britain, that are associated with the beaker culture. And I think that if you had done a poll among Irish archaeologists before those results, you would have been hard pressed to find a single person who imagined that such an event could possibly be associated with the introduction of the beakers to Ireland.
Yeah, well, and maybe the beakers were magical chalices,
But exactly.
in the indigenous people. Now, I did talk to Tom Booth at the Crick Institute, and he did say on the podcast that those results were a little bit extreme. He believes, he and his colleagues, because of basically their sampling issues for those centuries, and perhaps how the post-Neolithic people buried their
elsewhere.
And so like
the fact is that they were only sampling beaker burials.
And so the 90% replacement is that eventually that decreases over time, even though the majority of the ancestry is still from the beakers. There were other people in the other parts of Ireland that were eventually mixed in, and so again, the first pass result is a little bit more sensational than the reality. So we always need to be careful. I mean, I've taken a lot of your time, so I'll let you go. I really appreciate this conversation, giving us a historical perspective. I really recommend the listeners check out your past books, because there's a lot of good things in there. And I think you're going to enjoy your retirement as we learn more and more. But maybe you'll also get even more confused with the rest of us. I don't know.
Yes, I'm sure of that. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mallory.
This podcast for kids